Having that awareness that everyone would interpret things in different ways is really important. Número uno. Número dos, having conversations about it. So while we use time as a form of communication, silence as a form of communication, let's use our words. Verbal communication, really powerful. Silence can carry a significant meaning and is not merely an absence of speech. So silence isn't always silence. Silence could be a form of saying something. Give yourself permission to exist in the time and the cultural time that feels good to you.
Sabrosura pa' ti que.
Hello, everyone. This is Pam, de Café con Pam, the bilingual podcast that features Latine and people of the global majority who break barriers, change lives, and make this world a better place. Welcome to episode 361 of Café con Pam. Today is just going to be you and me, and we are going to talk about a topic that is so close to me. I'm very passionate about it. And every time I teach it to my clients, I share it, I have done presentations on it, people are like, oh my gosh, things make so much sense. So let's get right into it. El día de hoy vamos a hablar, and this is going to be very Spanglish because why not? Primero que nada, salud. Tengo mi cafecito. Ay, no me gusta when I drink coffee that the cup is like transparent because I feel like you're judging my milkiness of it. Bueno, today we're going to talk about chronemics. It's called chronemics, and chronemics is the study of time in communication. And the reason why I'm passionate about chronemics, because uno, as a recovering procrastinator, I realized that my time operates different from other people. I realized this when I landed in the US when I was 19 years old with my 2 maletas, and I started going to, first I tried to go to college first, but then I had to work first. So I went into the corporate world, and the expectations were very different, and the way that people operated was very different here. I had already worked in Mexico in an office, but it was just different. And so I wondered, am I just like broken, Then later I found out I had ADHD, which we could get a little bit into it. But chronemics, just to give you an overview of what it is, it's not a science necessarily, but it's the study of how people communicate through the use of time. It's cultural. It's influenced by culture and many times geography, but not always, but it's very cultural. And so there are two types of culture. You have monochronic and you have polychronic cultures. I'm going to explain not necessarily what they are, but the cultural, geographical, many times identifiers. Monochromic people, typically, not always, but because chronemics is a cultural way of communicating, many times geographies operate in such way. And so the United States, Germany, Russia, Switzerland, those are monochronic places just by nature. The structural, systemic, everything has been built around being monochronic. Polychronic cultures, Latin America, Africa, the Caribbean, the Middle East. And my theory, this is not based on studies, my theory is like colder type of climates, they're monochronic, warmer climates, they're polychronic. To bring it back to the differences between the two, monochronic people, they value time within time. They feel respected when you exist within time, because to a monochronic person, time is a finite resource. To a polychronic person, they value relationships within time, because to a polychronic person, hay más tiempo que vida. I don't know if you've ever heard that, but I hear my mom say this all the time. Hay más tiempo que vida, which is there's more time than life. If you say there's more time than life to a monochronic person, they're going to look at you like you're out of your mind, because that's not true. They don't believe that. They believe that time is finite. And so even when you hear all of these productivity people, really tune in to see if they exist as monochronic or polychronic, because if they're existing as monochronic, they're going to tell you you're going to run out of time. Whereas if you listen to someone polychronic, they're going to say, time is within you. You are time. You exist within time. And so this is why I notice when first, second generations, they go explore and they go visit their country of heritage. Many times people are like, oh my gosh, every time I land, I feel like time doesn't exist. Every time I come here, my life just expands so much. Time is just very slow. It's because the cultural geography of time is different. And us coming from a place, living, existing in a monochronic place, transferring ourselves to a polychronic space feels more like home, because naturally we come from polychronic cultures. Fascinating. Now, societally, I'm sure you've heard, brown people time, black people time, people of color time. All of those things are very much related to chronemics. And so instead of saying, it's because I'm brown, I'm late, you could say it's because I'm polychronic, which, not everyone knows what chronemics are, but there's a reason why. And I share this because give yourself permission to exist in the time and the cultural time that feels good to you. However, here's like the caveat to it. We exist and we live, if you're listening in the US, we live in a monochronic culture. If you're naturally polychronic, we have to adapt, which is have to because that's the way that we exist. And we can also exist. And so this is where I can give you some examples of how at work, which is mainly how people get affected, is at work. Many times in family dynamics as well, we'll talk about it, how you can maneuver those situations and create expectations, because context is really important. So to bring it back for a second around the two cultures, when it comes to communication, chronemics is one way that we communicate. We also communicate through voice, through sounds. Sounds include words, include music. We also communicate through movement. So that's kinetics in a way. Kinetics is body language. So movement could be also dance. This is why many times, art is a form of communication. When you go and you watch a performance and people dance and move and sing and speak, all of those forms are forms of communication. And another form of communication is the way we behave. And this is where monochronic or polychronic cultural differences come into play. One very important thing that we don't talk about enough when it comes to communication is silence. Silence, it's also a form of language. And this is from a study by, these names are really hard to say. I'm going to say them wrong and I apologize. But this is by Florentina Birjol and Diana Elena Lonesk. And the article explores the complex nature of communication, and it emphasizes the nonverbal forms of communication. One is chronemics, and two is the language of silence. So the reason why I bring silence is because as we exist in two different types of cultures, we also need to pay attention of how we use silence, because it could mean very different things for different people, depending on the context, the situation, and who it is, what's happening when things are happening. I'm quoting the article. Silence can carry a significant meaning and is not merely an absence of speech. So silence isn't always silence. Silence could be a form of saying something. It could indicate respect. It could indicate thinking. It could indicate refusal. It could indicate power. Super important, because at work, silence is crucial for communication. Think about the hierarchy of how we exist. Monochronic people are very hierarchical. Polychronic people are very circular. Hierarchical meaning a triangle, if you're not watching this in the video. Polychronic exist more circular, meaning we put a round table and everyone has a voice. Monochronic folks, just naturally, that's the way that there's no right or wrong ways. Like, I mean, I have thoughts on it, but that's how things have existed. And so hierarchical means somebody's in charge and they make decisions kind of like trickling down. Think about how we have existed at work. Many times, the majority of times, we exist in a hierarchical setting. Somebody's in charge. We have a boss, we have a supervisor, we have a manager, we have a CEO, et cetera, et cetera. And there's also this like idea of like goals of becoming a CEO, right? Which is a very hierarchical structure. And so thinking about the hierarchy of how we exist at work, if the boss shows up late, thinking in a monochronic space, being on time means you are going to arrive before the time we said. Time is finite, right? So we exist between the segments of the beginning and the end in monochronic cultures. For a superior, a boss, the CEO, whatever, if they show up past the time that we set, that's a use of power because they're making us wait. Now, if we switch it and we bring someone who's not in charge, maybe it's an entry-level person, all things considered based on a monochronic hierarchical structure, if they show up past the time that we said, then they are late. Their use of silence is used against them. And so see how silence is also a form of communication, and depending on the context, it is used different. And so I'm thinking that you're thinking a lot right now as you're hearing this. And I think it's important for us to start having these conversations because more and more, I mean, this has happened for a long time. The United States, because I'm based in the US, the majority of my audience is in the US. I share this from a US based perspective. I notice there's a lot of cultural differences, not just in, where people are from, but also how we use time. And time is such a form of communicating that it has, for generations, it has created disconnects between people because people on one end feel disrespected and on another end also feel disrespected because they are speaking a different language of time. And so my purpose for you to listen to this today is to have some awareness as you continue to navigate in life and experience people with different time cultures. So how could we operate together? Well, one, we have to have awareness, which I think at this point, you understand that there are two forms of communicating through time. That awareness can give you an understanding of the other person that you may be dealing with. A great way to figure out whether people are monochronic or polychronic is to ask, what does an eternity mean to you? Cuando alguien dice, se va a tardar una eternidad, ¿qué piensas? What do you think when someone says, oh, that's going to last an eternity? And of course, have an actual example. So something simple like, I'm going to make dinner. What does it mean to you when I say, oh, it's going to take an eternity for dinner to be done? Then for a monochronic person, an eternity could be, it's going to take 2 hours. For a polychronic person, an eternity could be like, I don't know, we might just eat tomorrow morning, might as well. Because a polychronic person expands in time, so they don't have a notion of the beginning and the end. They just know that it exists. A monochronic person has a notion of what the beginning and the end is. And so they are much more aware and they want to know, okay, if it's going to take an eternity, to me, an eternity is 2 hours. So I expect this. If you're starting at 5, by 7, we're eating dinner. Having that awareness that everyone would interpret things in different ways is really important. Número uno. Número dos, having conversations about it. So while we use time as a form of communication, silence as a form of communication, let's use our words. Verbal communication, really powerful. And so this is where you can provide context to whoever it is that you're dealing with and say, look, the way that I see time is a little bit different than what we're used to. And so I want to make sure that we are communicating in a way that makes sense for both of us. So, two ways that where chronemics kind of gets in the way the most: meetings and negotiation. So, meetings, it's like I hear it a lot. It's that meme that's like, this meeting could have been an email. That's a very monochronic way. Monochronic. I don't know why I keep saying monochromic. It's monochronic. So, meeting dynamics, polychronic folks, we're going to just call it poly and mono. So, poly folks, we need to adapt to the mono way of existing because that's just the way that the US, if you live here, if you're listening from the US, you'll likely have to adapt. This is a form, I guess we could say, of assimilation. Now, many times poly people are poly at home and they become mono at work. Now, what happened with the pandemic and working from home? That shifted and that created a lot of internal time chaos because poly people were used to, having a start and an end to work, which was very monochronic. And then they would get home and time would disappear and they would expand into the time and have fun at home. Now we're working from home. And so it's this adjustment the polychronic people had to deal with. And so I invite monochrones to, be a little bit more gracious. If you are meeting with someone and they arrive 2-3 minutes late, understand that they may not have an awareness of what time truly means, and setting expectations. So, going back to meetings, setting expectations, making sure that if you are setting up the meeting, typically who sets the meeting up is who determines the culture of time. So, if you are a monochronic person and you are setting up the meeting, then, you set the tone of how time is used. If a poly person sets the meeting, then mono people will want to kind of like end faster because the poly person will just expand. This is where ADHD comes in many times because ADHD, we don't have, it's not that we don't have a notion of time, but we just lose track of it. We're very naturally polychronic, even like regardless of your country of origin and your heritage. And so awareness, number one, setting expectations, having conversations, and choosing to understand, especially for monochronic. But I'll give you an example of what could happen when there's that disconnect that happened recently. So, meeting dynamics, making sure that things are with lots of clarity. Agendas help a ton. Having a clear start and end time, having a goal is really important. And so for polychronic people, they enjoy pleasantries. Monochrones don't. Monochrones are just like, let's get right to business because time is finite, right? A polychronic person is like, well, but ask me how my dog is because that's important to me because they value relationships in time. So this is where we want to consider how are we going to find a happy median, and that's up to you. Negotiations and collaboration. So this is where, again, having awareness of silence, because especially in negotiation, como dicen, el que habla pierde, ¿no? Whoever talks first loses in a negotiation. That's the use of silence. And so understanding and being patient and having clarity of who you're dealing with. Again, ask the question, like, what would mean to you if I said this negotiation would take an eternity? Some people might be like, oh, it will never end. Some people might be like, we're going to be done at 2, you know? And so having that awareness, flexibility, and adaptability in time management. And when it comes to negotiating, monochronic people they want to get right into it. A poly person might take a few days actually because they have to think about it. They have to really evaluate the relationship that you have with them. So there's a lot of more layers that happen. And so really understanding who you're dealing with, same awareness, understanding, clarity, context, conversation. Because ultimately, a successful collaboration is when everyone wins. And a way to make sure that everyone wins is to understand each other. That's chronemics. So I'll give you a quick example of of how disconnects could happen. And this literally happened this week, and I was laughing about it because I am part of a Facebook group that's called Buy Nothing. If you don't know about Buy Nothing, go search for your neighborhood, like find your Buy Nothing group. It's great. You literally, as it says, you buy nothing. So if you want to get rid of something that's still very useful, you don't want to deal with putting it on sale, you can put it on Buy Nothing and people will take those things from you. So recently, I found some chairs that I could put outside of my yard. And this person was like, hey, I have these chairs. Whoever wants them, come get them. And I was like, oh my gosh, these would be great for my yard. Let's go. So she messaged me and she was like, here's my address. They're going to be outside of my garage. Just take them. Perfect. I've lived in the US for a long time. I don't know the exact number, but enough for me to be able to understand a monochronic deal. So she was like, they're outside, let's go. So my brother came with me. My brother just moved back to the US and we parked and of course the chairs were outside right by the garage and I'm like, "Oh, there they are. Let's go." And he was like, "Where is she?" And I'm like, "I don't know. She left the chairs. We're picking up the chairs. We're going to go because that was the deal, right?" And he's like, "She's not going to come out and say hello." And like, and I'm like, "No, she's not because there's no need. The deal is she's giving me the chairs. I'm picking up the chairs. She told me where they are. Negotiation is done and complete." And so, as an adapted monochronic person, I understood that the transaction was transactional. For my brother, who's very much still a polychronic person, he didn't understand that the transaction wasn't relational, it was transactional. And for him, he was like, that's very rude. Like literally we had a whole conversation in the car because we went and took the chairs, put them in the car, drove home, and the whole drive home he was like, that just like feels like so rude. It's so disconnected. Like she didn't come out to say hello. And I'm laughing and I'm like, yeah, because she doesn't communicate that way. In her mind, it's not rude. I, as an adapted monochronic person, I didn't see it as rude. I saw it as a transaction. For a polychronic person like my brother, he saw it as an act of disrespect because she didn't take the time to build the relationship, even though it wasn't like, we're not going to become friends, right? Like she just gave me some chairs. It's done. That's how many times I see it, and I see it all the time, and I laugh every time because people feel disrespected in both ways. I could give you many other examples of how a monochronic person could feel disrespected because a poly person came late. That's one of the biggest ones. Mono people so not like when people show up late. And so this is a lack of understanding that time bends much more for poly people. Time is finite for mono people. So now that you know a little bit more, I hope you know how to understand each other better. We want to make sure we have awareness. We want to understand. We want to set expectations and we want to communicate. This is where we can use our words and say, this is how I exist. How do you exist? How could we coexist? Because we're just going to operate in the way that we do unless one or both adapt. Many times, poly people adapt to mono people. But here comes for the mono people that travel to poly places. You have to adapt. So, you know how recently there was this whole outrage of the immigrants. I don't call them expats because what does that mean? Like they're immigrants to a different country. So the people that are migrating to Mexico Americans, they were making a big deal because banda was playing and they felt that it was too loud. That's a very monochronic way. And so the entitlement that happened from monochrones existing in a polychronic place was just wrong, because you can't come into a geographically, culturally poly place and expect people to become monochrones. It's not going to happen. And so, the same way how when poly people come to a mono place, we adapt and adopt, same way to the other side. When mono people go to poly places, you have to adapt and adopt. And so, now, one more thing to clarify: just because maybe you're a white person doesn't mean that you are naturally a monochronic person. It's not always like that. There's different variables. So there's also a lot of people of color, for example, who are very monochronic. I'm an adapted monochronic person, but I exist naturally as a polychronic person. Not everyone, just because they are come from a specific ethnic background, they're not going to use time the same. That's kind of like the norm. It's the geographical culture of it. But because we have traveled and migration patterns and so many other things, people have also assimilated and adapted to different uses of time. I share that to say you can't assume that just because, someone looks like you, they might use the time the same way that you do. Doesn't happen that way. It's just communication. Go and talk about it. Iguana listeners, I thought this episode was going to be 10 minutes, but of course, I am passionate about this topic, and so I'll let you be. I hope this was useful in some way. I would love to hear your comments, your thoughts. How are you going to implement it? How are you going to talk maybe to your family about it? Family dynamics, we didn't talk about it, but that's another thing. If you get mono and people together and, it's like the infamous birthday party for brown people. And, you know, I know that if you tell me to come at 3 p.m., I know the fiesta is actually going to start at 5. So I'm not stressing. But you have to clarify that with your white friends, because they're going to show up to barrer. They're going to show up to help you set up at 3, probably 2:30. And so this is where we need to adopt and adapt and clarify. You can tell your family show up at 3, but knowing that they'll show up at 5, and tell your monochronic people to show up at 3:30, knowing they'll show up at 3. All right. Well, listeners, I would love to hear your thoughts. Screenshot, tag, tell me all the things. I hope this was very useful. I have taught this in more of a presentation workshop type of format to companies, and they've thoroughly enjoyed it because it's something that we deal with daily, on a daily basis. And so if you are a company listening and you want to bring me on to talk about this, I do have a talk and a workshop to share with your company. It's super fun. Listeners, this is the time to ask for a way of support, whatever it is for you. I'm taking the time to give you this free content at no cost to you. And so if you feel called to reciprocate in some way, you can leave a rating and a review, whatever platform you are listening to this. If you're listening on a podcast platform, stars help, reviews also help. If you are watching the video on YouTube, commenting, liking the video, sharing, and of course, subscribing on all the places helps so much, because we are looking to increase that awareness of the show, so more and more people listen to this. Of course, send this to your whoever you thought about when you listen to this. And then you can discuss it. My goal for this was for you to create a conversation, to create awareness, and then have a conversation around how are we going to deal with each other now that we know. Y bueno, thank you so much for taking the time to be in here. Let's connect on social media at Café con Pan Podcast. Everywhere. You can check out cafeconpam.com. We have more and more content. We have more stories that we are sharing. We have YouTube exclusives. Also, come in, and if you're not on YouTube, come and subscribe on YouTube, because we are sharing YouTube exclusive interviews that they're not going anywhere else, just in the tube. So come and subscribe and thank you so much for being here. Y bueno, como siempre, stay shining.
Sabrosura pa' ti que